Okay, are slides showing up for folks now? Okay. Thank you, Joanne, for calling that out. Appreciate that. All right. So you didn't miss much on the first couple of slides. So when we're thinking about fossil fuel energy usage, tends to fall into three main buckets: transportation, planes, automobiles. The second being industrial processes that utilize burning of fossil fuels, especially those that require high temperatures, like different types of material refining. And then the third major bucket, and the one that we're obviously most focused on as a coalition, are commercial and residential buildings. Specifically, what we use to keep them, warm and provide hot water and comfort to folks in those buildings are a big source of fossil fuel usage. As I went through that, maybe for a few of you, the question crossed your mind about, well, you didn't mention electricity as one of those three main buckets. And that's because we kind of think of electricity as sort of a middleman to those other three, right? In some cases, the energy being delivered for transportation or industrial use or building energy usage is coming from electricity. Sometimes it's direct burning of fossil fuels at the site. So we just kind of think of it that way. And right now we know that around 2/3 of US electricity still derives from fossil fuels of some sort, mostly coal or natural gas. And only 10% is coming from what we would consider renewable sources like wind and solar. So certainly there's a fair amount of fossil fuel, carbon heavy energy that's being passed through to buildings in the form of electricity. All right. So I'm going to drop another poll question for you all here again. This time, what percentage of US CO2 emissions do you think come from residential and commercial buildings in a typical year? And I give you some ranges there to think about. So thinking about, again, those three main buckets of things that burn fossil fuels in the US or get carbon heavy electricity. What percentage of that do you think eventually goes to our residential and commercial buildings? Let me know if that poll's not showing up for some of you. We'll just give it a little bit more time here for folks to respond to that. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share those results. And yeah, there's a bit of a range of responses here from folks who had that pegged in that, only being about a fifth of CO2 emissions, up to a couple of folks who had it up to, anywhere from 2/3 to 80% of our emissions. That biggest response group, those of you that had it in that 20 to 40% range, you're right. According to data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, or EIA, which is an office of the Department of Energy, and you'll hear me quoting from some of their statistics a few times here. In 2022, they found that commercial and residential buildings accounted for around 35% of US CO2 emissions. And that's pretty consistent. If you look at most recent years, they're kind of in around that third of the carbon emissions in the US are coming from where we live and where we work. All right, so if we want to start looking and reducing that third of our country's CO2 emissions that come from the residential and commercial building sectors. How do we do that? What actually is building decarbonization? And the easiest way that I found to kind of break that topic down for folks that aren't familiar with building decarb already is this idea of a new 3 Rs. So I think a lot of us grew up with reduce, reuse, recycle when we were talking about reducing material waste for building decarb, thinking of it in terms of reduce, replace, renewables. So reduce what those of us that work in the industry or the policy field would think of as energy efficiency, but just this idea of limiting the amount of energy that our homes and buildings need in the first place to be functional and comfortable to live in. The second R, that replace, and again, those of you that are more working or familiar with building decarb policy probably call this electrification, but converting those appliances that currently run directly on fossil fuels, like stoves, water heaters, furnaces, boilers, to some sort of equivalent that can run on electricity. And then that final R, renewables, making sure that that electricity that all of that equipment is running in is also carbon free, or delivering other forms of non-electric carbon free energy to buildings to utilize. So again, those 3 Rs kind of form that framework, and we'll dive in a little bit more in depth of what those all mean as we go here. And then I think if there's one takeaway that I want folks to take away from this afternoon, it's that we can't do any of those 3 separately. They all work in conjunction with each other to truly move us to building decarbonization. So kind of thinking of it as like a 3-legged stool, right? If you take out one of those legs, the whole thing's going to fall over. And again, we'll talk a little bit more as we go of why we can't do any of those 3 separately from each other if our goal is to eliminate carbon emissions from the Midwest building sector. All right, so digging deeper into each of those 3 Rs individually, we're going to start with reduce or energy efficiency and what that could all entail, especially when our focus is on building decarbonization. So if our end goal is building decarbonization, really the main energy usage that we're looking to reduce in the buildings is how much heating and cooling do they really need to keep the people living and working inside comfortable. So that can encompass things like building weatherizations, kind of sealing those air gaps and things that cause warm or cold air to leak out or folks to feel drafty and uncomfortable. Higher performance insulation and windows. So again, keeping that heat inside when you want it or keeping it outside when you don't. It can mean utilizing waste heat from our buildings. So think of the fans that you use to exhaust the stinky air from your bathroom or over your hood in your kitchen and things like that. That's all air that was probably heated up or cooled down by your furnace or air conditioner that's now just going outside, and it's being replaced by fresh air from the outside that now needs to be heated up or cooled down. So what can we do to reuse some of that instead of just sending it outside? Can also reduce those heating and cooling needs through smarter thermostats or controls, right? So not heating when we don't need it or cooling when we don't need it and things like that. It can also mean delivering that heating and cooling with less energy as well, right? So when we've reduced the amount of it that we need, how can we deliver that by utilizing less electricity? And I'll talk a little bit more about specific pieces of equipment when we get to that next R. But in general, the good news is that decarbonized heating equipment, those electric uh, heaters, water heaters, and cooking equipment can deliver the same amount of heat and comfort, typically on the order of a third less energy than their gas equivalents. So it's a little bit of killing two birds with one stone. And then why can't we decarbonize without that reduce or energy efficiency step? Well, a few good reasons to keep in mind. One, it limits the demand for new electricity on the grid, right? So we talked before about how only 10% of our electricity nationwide is currently coming from solar or wind. 2/3 of it is coming from fossil fuel sources. So that means that we simply need way more clean electric generation to eliminate um, eliminate that source of carbon emissions. So anything we can do to reduce the amount of that new electricity we need is to the good. It makes that aspect of it easier. It can have lower upfront costs for the same impact on emissions and pollution. Um, so I know specifically when to take the example of heat pump water heaters, um, we we can see that the amount of electricity that would be saved by moving from electric resistance water heater to a heat pump water heater is the equivalent of having to install 8 solar panels on that rooftop to generate that same amount of electricity. And in a lot of cases, we find that to be the case, that it's cheaper to reduce the amount of energy that a building needs than it is to generate that same amount of clean energy. It helps mitigate negative impacts on utility bills. So, right now across the Midwest, unfortunately, a lot of folks are in the case where the rate structure that they're currently on probably means that it feels like natural gas is going to be cheaper for them to heat their home with than electricity. So if we can combine with some energy efficiency that can negative or mitigate that negative impact and hopefully make that transition something that more folks can consider. And also just beyond any of the energy implications, a lot of the things that we talk about in that reduce or energy efficiency step of decarbonization are also things that just make your home more comfortable to live in. I talked about reducing drafts and things like that. Just makes it a nicer place to live in general. So I'm going to drop another poll question here. And on this one, I'm asking you how much of the annual energy usage in Midwest homes comes from heating and water heating. So thinking about all of the things in your home that utilize energy that you're paying a gas or electric bill for, how much of that in a typical Midwest state do you think traces back to heating, so your furnace or water heating? I'm seeing some responses come in, so I'll just give it another minute here for more folks to respond, and then we'll see how you did. All right. Looks like everybody has responded now, so I'm going to end the poll and share those results. So it looks like most of you had it pegged in that 60 to 80% range. A few of you in that 40 to 60% range, and then we had a couple that assumed it was kind of on the lower end of things. So the answer, and this is going to set up that second R, replace or electrification, is that 72% of residential energy consumption in the Midwest is for space and water heating. And this again comes from data collected by the Energy Information Administration. So that means that the vast majority of energy use in folks' homes in the Midwest goes to heating and water heating, with over half of that energy usage coming from space heating, and then another 17% or so coming from the water heater, which, if you kind of back up and think about it, makes sense, right? We have, compared to other parts of the country, a longer heating season than other parts of the country, and a longer or more intense heating season than other parts of the country, right? Other than maybe like New England, this is the part of the country that's going to get the coldest and stay cold for the longest, and we're going to have to consume a lot of energy to keep our homes warm. So why is this super important when it comes to talking about decarb? Well, for about 4/5 of Midwest homes, they are using fossil fuel combustion as their main source of heat, right? For most folks, natural gas, but also a fair amount of propane or wood burning as their main fuel source. Right now, only about 1/5 of Midwest homes have electricity as their main fuel when they're heating their homes. So again, that makes building decarb like a uniquely Midwest climate concern, right? We're using most of our energy for heating of some kind, and we're mostly using fossil fuels to do it. So how do we change that that equation? So again, I mentioned before that I'd talk a little bit more about some of these pieces of equipment that we're looking at here. So I mentioned space heating and water heating being the main culprits here for using fossil fuels at the site of our homes and offices. And the main solution there, probably old news to a lot of folks attending this call, is heat pumps of some sort, right? Both for space heating and cooling, right? The ones that would either take the place of your central furnace and AC, or maybe be a mini split that sits in your home, but also for increasingly for water heating as well, moving off of a gas burner and tank, or a less efficient electric water heater to one that utilizes a heat pump as well. Beyond the heat pumps, there are other things that can utilize fossil fuels for energy in folks' homes. Most notably, the next one would be cooking appliances, right? Those gas stoves. So looking to replace those with induction stoves and other cooking equipment as well. And then any of those other odds and ends, folks that still have gas clothes dryers and things like that as well. I think we had a pretty informed group at the top, so I'm not going to dwell on the what is a heat pump aspect of this presentation too long, but just for folks that could use a refresher, or folks that joined us late that aren't familiar, just understanding that a heat pump is a heating and cooling appliance that moves heat instead of creating it, right? So instead of burning a fuel or converting electricity directly into heat, it's moving heat that already exists somewhere else outside of your home inside when you want it. So think of it as your air conditioner or your refrigerator running in reverse, right? The most common one that we think of, right now is what we would call an air source heat pump. So it's pulling that heat from the outside air around you. But there are other varieties of heat pump that can pull heat that's available underground year round, that we would call a ground source or geothermal heat pump, or from other available sources of waste heat that it can pull from. Getting into, well, why can't we decarbonize without it? Or maybe another way of framing that question for the replace section is thinking of like, well, why wouldn't we just wait until the electricity is 100% clean to start doing some of this? So one answer that I already gave is that the equipment is much more efficient already. So it just utilizes less energy, even if the electricity supplying it isn't 100% clean yet. Another aspect of this is that every time that we install gas equipment in somebody's home or workplace, it lasts a long time, right? The average life of a gas furnace or a split air conditioning system is just under 20 years. We just replaced one in our home that had been there for around 30 years. So as we're thinking about hitting some of these targets that our states or cities have set for 2030 or 2035, we know that any gas equipment that we're putting in now, either as part of a new construction project or replacing in somebody's home, that's going to last past that target point, right? Um, and not work towards those goals. And then looking even further ahead to 2050, where we know the science says we need to be hitting net zero emissions to head off the worst effects of climate change. We see maybe we get one more shot at replacing that gas equipment at the end of its life, but other components of the building will still be in place as we had them, right? Um, the electric service that initially got installed with that building will probably still be in place in size to whatever we're putting in now. The building shell is going to last, much longer than 30 or 50 years into the future, hopefully. And that means that if those things are not optimized for electric equipment now, even if folks don't feel ready to make the leap all the way off of fossil fuel for everything, that we're sticking those future tenants or building owners with some expensive upgrades that they don't need to have to accommodate this future equipment. So the time is now to be either moving to this equipment completely or at least putting in all of the infrastructure that's going to support it in the future. And again, I mentioned before that question of, why wouldn't we just wait till electricity is 100% clean? And I kind of use this chart as an example of that question. So this is based off of public data that Xcel Energy in Minnesota put out about their estimated CO2 levels um, uh, on their electric grid that they were providing customers in Minnesota in 2005. And then they looked at it again in 2019 to see the progress that they had made in cleaning up the grid, and then projecting out their targets for the end of the decade, and then hitting 100% renewables in the future. And actually, I probably need to update this because this was before Minnesota passed their clean electric legislation, but I think the point still stands. So what you see here, and really I think focus in on those red and green lines, is that in 2005, if somebody was building a new home or replacing a heating system, it would have looked like a high efficiency gas furnace would result in less carbon every year than a heat pump system, but it was close based on how dirty the Minnesota grid was at that time. But 14 years later, so probably about halfway through the life of that heating system, right? It had flipped. The grid had become cleaner, and now that heat pump was producing less emissions annually than the gas furnace. But what you see is, if you had made that decision to stick with a gas furnace in 2005, you didn't see any of that benefit as the grid cleaned up, right? That gas furnace is still directly burning fossil fuels at the site of your home through that whole period, and nothing that's happening with the grid is going to change that. And now we look forward at folks making that decision now, looking forward to that 2030 target, and we see what we anticipate is going to happen with those emissions associated with that heat pump as the decade continues. And we can see it's just going to keep getting better in terms of its impact on climate. And that gas furnace is just going to stay the same and last another 30 years doing it. So again, just being forward thinking in terms of what types of appliances we're installing in folks' homes. All right, I'm going to stop sharing our last poll question and bring up another one for you. And this time I'm going to ask on average, how much did residential natural gas rates increase for Midwest BDC states from 2018 to 2022? So over a 5-year period, how much did percentage-wise did natural gas rates go up on average across the Midwest BDC footprint? I'm seeing some responses come in, so I'll hold on and see if we get a couple more here. Right. Looks like those responses are slowing down, so I'm gonna, oh, yeah, one more there. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll though, and go ahead and share those results. Okay, so most of you had it in that kind of 40 to 60% range, and a few of you had it lower. So hold on to that thought. And I'm going to bring up a second question of how much do you think residential electric rates increased across Midwest BDC states over that same period? Right. And those responses come in. All right, a little bit more of a range here, but most of you had it pegged in that 20 to 40% range. But a few of you going higher, even one of you having it in that 80 to 100% range. Let me go to the next slide. So really smart people in this group on the gas side. Over that period, the natural gas rate rose on average for Midwest BDC states around 45%. So I think most of you had it in that range. Although I will note that we had some states that were significantly higher. So I know Illinois was the worst culprit, almost 70% increase in how much folks were paying for natural gas over that period. You all were a little bit more pessimistic about the average electric increase over that period. So according to the EIA, across the 8 states that Midwest BDC works with, the average increase was around 12%. So significantly less than the natural gas side. Obviously, everybody has different utilities, and that can vary differently even within the same state, depending on whose service territory you're in. So I don't mean to dismiss anybody's like specific lived experience with their utility, but in general, what we see is that although a lot of us currently understand of like, well, natural gas, the rates are cheaper even if you're using more energy than electric, so it's an economic burden to move from gas heating to electric heating. And while that is still somewhat true, we are hitting that inflection point with it, and we're projecting that that's going to continue to change, right? So both because of the higher efficiency of the electric units and that gas rates tend to be look to be increasing at a much higher rate than electric, that's not going to hold true. And again, I'll go back to this stuff lasts a long time when you install it in folks' homes and workplaces. So thinking through of like, well, what are those utility rates going to look like in 5 years? It's probably not going to look as good of an idea economically to keep folks on that natural gas rate. And we know that when those increases happen, they have a much higher income in terms of household energy burden on low income households than high income, almost 10% greater impact in terms of the percentage of household income that goes towards energy for low income households than high income. And why are we seeing this difference in gas prices compared to electric? Well, one is that there's been a lot of high demand, cold weather events and things like that that have caused gas utilities to have to buy up natural gas very quickly to meet demand over that time period. And now they're having to recover those costs by charging customers. On the electric side, because there's a much more varied range of fuels that are used to generate electricity, and increasingly, renewable energy like solar and wind, they are not as impacted by that volatile price of that one fuel as the gas utilities. So again, just thinking through, forward thinking of that economic benefit outside of the climate concerns of moving more folks onto this decarbonized heating and water heating in their homes. We also know that this is a critical health issue as well, right? And if we're just doing clean electricity and just doing energy efficiency and not actually getting gas equipment out of folks' homes, they're missing out on those health benefits as well, right? So we know we're, as a society, spending increasing amounts of time indoors. We all lived through the COVID-19 pandemic that I think really drove that point home for a lot of us. And that means that the state of our indoor air quality really has a huge impact on our health. And there's a growing field of research linking gas appliances, specifically cooking appliances, but also heating and water heating appliances with negative health outcomes, especially when it comes to respiratory health. So much higher concentrations of NO2 or other contaminants in the air with homes that have those appliances, much higher rates of children developing asthma symptoms. And we know that they may be leaking contaminants into the air even when we're not actively burning things. So again, lots of good reasons to move towards decarbonization even outside of the climate concerns. And then that last R to touch on today is that renewables or carbon-free electricity. Again, we don't want to just displace this pollution to somewhere else. When we're doing that replace step, we want to make sure that electricity that's serving all of these new appliances is carbon-free as well. So I think this is one that folks are kind of most familiar with, maybe in terms of what it entails, generating clean electricity, whether that be at the building itself, things like rooftop solar or community solar, or ensuring that the utilities that you're purchasing that electricity from are generating it in a clean way, like wind or solar or hydropower. Just making sure that those kilowatts that are reaching the home are not resulting in carbon pollution elsewhere. Can also mean, matching that supply of clean electricity with the demand at our building site, whether that mean having batteries at the buildings themselves to bank up that clean electricity when it's most available and be able to meet demand when it's not, or doing the same on the electric grid. It can also mean having smarter appliances that can match up when they're using energy with when the clean electricity that we have is most available. So I mentioned heat pump water heaters before, and they're a great opportunity for this type of thing. with your water heater, what's your concern, right? That there's going to be a tank of hot water available when I want to, take a shower or need hot water for something else. But you don't necessarily care when that water gets heated up in the tank, right? So there's an opportunity there for heat pump water heaters that say, hey, I'm gonna heat up this tank of water during these hours of the day when there's less demand for electricity, and not do it when everybody's running their air conditioner at their peak or something like that. And again, making sure that we limit the amount of that new clean electricity that we have to build. And then there are also non-electric forms of clean energy that we can be delivering to buildings. There's a whole developing world of this idea of thermal energy networks, which are basically a large geothermal heat pump system that can serve multiple buildings, that can move heat where you don't want it, like a supermarket refrigerator system or an ice rink, and move that heat to folks' homes to provide essentially free heating to folks. So that's another path forward of delivering energy to folks' homes to keep them warm and comfortable. That doesn't involve burning fossil fuels. And why can't we decarbonize without that last step of renewables? And I touched on. Oh, this is a repeat of before. So that is actually the end of our presentation here today. And we do have some time remaining here. So I'm happy to take any questions that folks might have about building decarb or Midwest BDC before we depart. And I can look in the chat to see if there were any that I missed as I went as well. But yeah, feel free to either throw your hand up or put questions in the chat there. So I see a couple questions from Mary Alice as we went. Yes. So we want to raise the percentage of solar and wind. Mary Alice said, yeah, and I think we touched on that during that last section of the presentation, but just looking back to the beginning where we saw that right now, only around 10% of our electricity is coming from solar and wind. Around 2/3 is coming from gas or coal or other fossil fuel power plants. So, again, our goal is not just to remove the burning of fossil fuels from our buildings, but make sure that the the energy that we're providing to buildings isn't tracing back to pollution in somebody else's community as well. So we want those percentages to be at 100% of where that electric energy is coming from. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions. I'll just say a couple of things. We are recording today, and we do try to keep a fairly current version of this presentation up on our website that you can send folks to. Also say to anybody on the presentation that is a Midwest BDC member or is thinking about becoming a member, and you think, hey, I'd maybe like to give this presentation to folks in my community, that we do have a train the trainer program that has like a trimmed down version of this presentation that's designed for you to go and talk to your church green team or whoever about building decarb. So please reach out if that's something that you're interested in the future. And I see one question in the Q&A. What are Midwest BDC's thoughts on wood as a heat source for northern and rural homes that don't have reliable power? Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I will say that the research that I've seen on wood burning, and specifically that industry's claims to being carbon neutral, are that that's a little bit misleading. Uh, I, I understand why folks want it or want it as a backup. Um, but I don't think they should be under any illusions that like, well, just because you're burning it, but then you're planting a new tree, isn't that carbon neutral? It's not. Um, yeah, I think that's kind of generally our coalition's stance on it. And I will say that, you know, there are options for all of that replace equipment that allow for some sort of backup heating source. There's drawbacks to that, right? That it still involves staying connected to gas infrastructure or things like that in some cases, but that is an option for those emergency um, emergency situations. And then I think the last piece I'll say on that is just like we have to improve um, electric reliability for all communities, way more from where it is right now. And that's not just because of wanting to convert our heating over to electricity. That's a concern. We just, had another summer with significant heat waves and things like that. And we know even our cold climate is getting much warmer in the summer. So we need that reliable electric service to provide cooling for folks as well. Any other questions that folks might have before we depart here today? Well, then I'll just add a couple more things in the chat. One is the resources page on midwestbdc.com, where you can find recordings of any of our or most of our past trainings that we've done. So some of them kind of expanding on things that we just touched on briefly here today. If you want to go more in depth, there's likely a training there that did that. I'll also call out our events page where you can see any other upcoming trainings and events that we have. So I know I'll call out that we have a training coming up in 2 weeks to walk through a new resource that we're releasing, talking about building codes and advocating for improvements there. So um, just watch that for any other upcoming webinars and trainings that we have. And then the last thing that I'll plug is just if you're not a Midwest BDC member, but you're interested in learning more and connecting with us deeper moving forward, that membership page has all the information about becoming a member of Midwest BDC. But I'm not seeing any more questions or hands up at this time as I went through all that. So I'll just do one last call. Otherwise, um, I can let you all get on with the rest of your day. All right. Well, we appreciate you making time to learn about building decarb with us today, and stay in touch. Thank you, everybody.